Alex gripped the wheel tightly, squinting into the growing twilight. The GPS had given up hours ago, leaving them with vague directions that looped through increasingly narrow forest roads. Beside him, Sophie leaned against the window, her phone held high in a futile attempt to catch a signal. "Still nothing," she said with a frustrated sigh. "It's like we're driving into the middle of nowhere." "Relax," Alex replied. "There's got to be a town or something nearby. We've passed signs for gas stations, just old ones." Minutes later, as the last of the sun dipped below the trees, they saw it, a small town nestled in a clearing. The sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Hallowmere," established in 1793 in ornate hand-painted letters. Lanterns strung between buildings glowed softly, casting the cobblestone streets in warm, inviting light. "Looks like we're in luck," Alex said, a smile breaking across his face. Sophie didn't share his enthusiasm. Something about the town felt off. It was too perfect, like a scene from an old postcard. The architecture was pristine, the windows lined with flower boxes bursting with blooms. There was no trash, no cars, no sign of anything modern at all. Still, her stomach growled audibly, and she had to admit the faint scent of roasting meat wafting through the air was tempting. As they parked near the town square, a group of people in traditional attire approached. They smiled warmly, their faces lit with genuine delight. "Welcome, travelers," a man called out, his voice booming with cheer. He looked like a character from a period drama with a neatly trimmed beard and suspenders. "Just in time for our festival." "What kind of festival?" Sophie asked cautiously. "Oh, it's our biggest celebration of the year," the man said. "Music, food, games, a celebration of life itself. You won't find anything like it anywhere else." Alex's stomach rumbled, louder than Sophie's had. "Sounds great. Do you have somewhere we can grab a bite?" The man nodded eagerly. "Of course. Come, let us show you around. You're our guests of honor tonight." The crowd parted, revealing a bustling square where children ran around laughing, couples danced to fiddle music, and townsfolk sold pies and roasted meats from wooden stalls. Everything about the scene exuded warmth, yet Sophie couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched closely. She tugged on Alex's sleeve. "This place is weird, don't you think?" "It's charming," Alex replied, grabbing her hand. "Come on, let's enjoy it." As they wandered deeper into the festival, Sophie noticed details she couldn't ignore. Symbols were carved into the wooden posts surrounding the square, intricate and strange, like runes from a forgotten language. And though everyone smiled and laughed, their eyes seemed just a little too wide, their movements just a little too synchronized. By the time the couple sat down at a table laden with steaming food, Sophie's unease had grown into something more profound. She glanced back at the gate they'd driven through. It was closed now, the heavy iron bars gleaming under the lantern light. The man from earlier appeared beside them, raising a toast. "To our guests," he said, his smile never faltering. "May you enjoy every moment of tonight." Sophie forced a smile, but the feeling gnawed at her. There was something about this place she didn't trust. Alex dug into his plate of roasted meat and vegetables with enthusiasm, the rich aroma enough to quell his travel-worn hunger. Sophie picked at hers, unable to shake the unease gnawing at her. Around them the festival carried on, a celebration that felt almost surreal. The townsfolk moved in perfect harmony. Dancers twirled and stomped to the lively tune of fiddles and tambourines, their movements eerily synchronized. Children darted between tables, giggling and playing, their laughter carrying on the cool evening breeze. Yet Sophie noticed none of them ever bumped into one another, as if the chaos were rehearsed. "Come on, Soph," Alex said, nudging her arm. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm not that hungry," she muttered, her eyes drifting to the carved posts around the square. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to shimmer in the firelight, almost alive. She tried to decipher their meaning, but they eluded her understanding, like glimpsing words in a dream that vanish when you focus. "You're missing out," Alex said, holding up a skewered piece of meat. "This is some of the best food I've ever had." Before Sophie could reply, a girl of about 8 stopped at their table, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Her eyes were large and unnervingly bright, her smile fixed as if it had been painted on. "Would you like a flower, ma'am?" the girl asked, her voice soft and lilting. Sure," Sophie said, taking one. Thank you." The girl's expression didn't change as she spoke again, her tone suddenly hushed. "You should leave before midnight." Sophie blinked, leaning forward. "What did you say?" Before the girl could answer, a sharp voice called out from nearby, "Elsie, don't bother the guests." A stern-looking woman strode over, her hands on her hips. She took the girl by the arm, her grip firm but not unkind. "I'm sorry about that," the woman said, her smile thin and forced. "She's just excited about the festival." "It's fine," Sophie said quickly. But as the woman led the girl away, Sophie saw Elsie's lips move silently, forming the word run. Her heart began to race. "Alex," she whispered, leaning toward him. "Something isn't right here." Alex glanced around, then back at her. "You're overthinking it. They're just being nice." "Too nice," Sophie countered, her voice low. "And that little girl, she told me to leave before midnight." Alex frowned, his fork pausing mid-air. "Midnight? Maybe she was just trying to spook you. It's a festival. They're probably big on local folklore or something." "Folklore doesn't explain the locked gate," Sophie hissed, pointing subtly toward the square's entrance. Alex followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "Okay, that's weird," he admitted. "Maybe they just don't want random people crashing the party." "Or maybe they don't want us leaving," Sophie said, her voice tight. Before Alex could respond, the music shifted. The lively, cheerful tune slowed, replaced by something haunting and somber. The dancers stopped mid-step, their smiles fading, and the townsfolk turned toward the bonfire being built in the center of the square. Sophie gripped Alex's arm. "I want to leave. Now." Alex nodded, his earlier confidence replaced by unease. But as they stood to go, they found themselves blocked by a group of townsfolk, their smiles returning, but now they felt like masks. "The best part of the festival is yet to come," one of them said cheerfully. "You wouldn't want to miss it." Sophie's grip on Alex's arm tightened as the townsfolk closed in around them, their cheerful demeanor almost suffocating. The couple exchanged a glance, silent agreement passing between them. They needed to leave now. "We actually have to head out," Alex said, attempting to keep his tone light. "We've got a long drive ahead of us." "Oh, nonsense," the man who'd greeted them earlier said, stepping forward. His grin stretched a little too wide, his eyes glinting with something darker than mere hospitality. "You're our guests of honor. It would be rude to leave before the bonfire ceremony." "We appreciate the invitation, but—" Sophie started, but her voice faltered as she caught sight of something in the man's hand. It was a small bone-carved charm, etched with the same symbols she'd seen on the posts around the square. The man followed her gaze and tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "It's tradition," he said simply. Alex forced a laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "Okay, how about we watch the ceremony for a bit, then head out? Deal?" The man's eyes flicked between them, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We'll see," he said cryptically, stepping aside to let them move toward the bonfire. As they walked, Sophie leaned in close to Alex, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that thing he was holding? It looked old. And those symbols—" Alex nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I saw. Let's just stick it out for a bit, act normal, and then we'll make a break for the car." But as they approached the bonfire, Sophie's unease deepened. The massive pyre was constructed from twisted branches and adorned with what looked like dried animal bones. Around its base, the same strange symbols were painted in a dark, glistening substance she prayed wasn't blood. The townsfolk began gathering, their movements deliberate and synchronized. Some carried wooden masks shaped like grotesque, elongated faces, while others held torches that crackled with an unnatural blue flame. A woman near Sophie caught her eye and smiled. It wasn't the friendly, welcoming smile from earlier. It was something else entirely, a predatory glint hiding behind her teeth. Sophie looked away quickly, her stomach twisting. A low hum started among the crowd, building slowly. It wasn't a song, not quite. It was more like a vibration that made Sophie's chest feel tight. "Okay, this is seriously creepy," Alex muttered, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. "We need to get out of here, now." As they edged toward the square's perimeter, Sophie spotted the gates again. A pair of men now stood guard, their expressions as blank as statues, hands resting on long wooden staffs carved with more of the strange symbols. Her breath hitched. "They're guarding the exit," she whispered. Alex followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "We'll find another way. Let's just keep moving." But as they tried to back away from the bonfire, a sudden cheer erupted from the crowd, startling them. The festival goers were all looking up at the pyre now, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue flames. At the top of the bonfire, Sophie could have sworn she saw something move, a shadow that shifted unnaturally against the firelight. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Alex said, pulling her closer, "but we're not staying to find out." The crowd's cheer reached a crescendo as the bonfire roared to life, the flames licking higher than seemed natural, casting eerie shadows over the square. Sophie's heart raced as she clutched Alex's arm. Whatever was happening here, it was far beyond a simple festival. "We need to find another way out," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's circle around. Stay close to the edges." The couple skirted the edge of the crowd, avoiding the gaze of the townsfolk as best they could. But no matter how far they moved, it felt like eyes followed them, unblinking and calculating. As they reached the far side of the square, Sophie spotted a narrow alleyway between two old stone buildings. She tugged Alex's sleeve and pointed. "There, let's try it." The moment they stepped into the alley, the noise of the festival seemed to dim, as if muffled by an invisible barrier. The cobblestones were slick with moss, the air colder and damp. Sophie shivered, glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. "Do you think this leads to the gate?" she asked. "Hopefully," Alex said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. The alley opened onto a small courtyard, dominated by a rusted iron gate. Relief washed over Sophie as she saw the forest beyond, the dark trees beckoning like an escape. But as they approached, their hopes were dashed. A heavy chain and padlock secured the gate, the links covered in strange markings etched deep into the metal. "Damn it," Alex muttered, rattling the chain. "Of course it's locked." Sophie stepped back, her chest tightening. "What are those symbols? They're everywhere in this town." Alex didn't answer, his attention focused on the chain. He pulled at it with all his strength, but it didn't budge. "They're meant to keep us here," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a festival. It's—" A sharp noise cut her off, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. She turned toward the alley, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" Alex froze, his hand still on the chain. "Yeah, we need to move." Before they could decide where to go, a figure stepped into the courtyard. It was the man who had greeted them when they arrived, his smile still plastered across his face, but now it felt more sinister, almost predatory. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone light, but with an edge that made Sophie's stomach drop. "Look, we're just trying to leave," Alex said, stepping in front of Sophie protectively. "We don't want any trouble." The man chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "Oh, but the festival isn't over yet. Midnight is the grand finale, and you wouldn't want to miss it. You're important to us." Sophie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, important?" The man's smile widened, his teeth catching the firelight from the square. "You'll see soon enough." He stepped aside, gesturing back toward the square. "Come now, the best is yet to come." Alex and Sophie hesitated, their instincts screaming to run, but the man's expression darkened. "Don't make this difficult." They had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to walk back toward the square, the man following close behind. As Alex and Sophie were herded back into the square, the air grew heavy with an oppressive energy. The bonfire roared higher, its flames taking on unnatural hues, deep blues and purples that danced like living things. The crowd had gathered in a tight circle around the fire, chanting in a guttural alien tongue that made Sophie's skin crawl. The man behind them nudged them forward, guiding them closer to the center of the square. Sophie's breath hitched as she saw the townsfolk donned in grotesque masks, each resembling a warped, otherworldly face with elongated features and too many eyes. "Stand here," the man commanded, gesturing to a spot directly in front of the bonfire. Sophie's hands balled into fists, her instincts screaming to run. But Alex grabbed her arm, shaking his head subtly. His expression was calm, but his grip was iron. "Let's not make this worse," he muttered under his breath. As they stood before the bonfire, the chanting ceased, and a silence fell over the square. It was so complete, so absolute, that Sophie's ears rang in the absence of sound. From the crowd emerged an elderly man, draped in a black robe, a carved staff in his hand. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes gleamed with unnatural vitality. He approached them slowly, the crowd parting reverently as he passed. "Welcome, travelers," the old man said, his voice resonating like a bell. "You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Alex demanded, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The old man's lips curled into a thin smile. "For salvation, for purpose. Your sacrifice will sustain us, as it has for centuries." Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her, her stomach churning. "What are you talking about?" The old man raised his staff, pointing it toward the bonfire. "Long ago, our town struck a bargain with a great and benevolent power, a deity of immense strength and wisdom. In exchange for its blessings, we offer a pair of souls each year, chosen by its will." "You're insane," Alex said, his voice rising. The old man chuckled. "Am I? Then perhaps you would prefer to meet our benefactor yourself." He turned toward the bonfire, chanting words that made Sophie's ears ache and her vision blur. The flames surged, twisting and writhing until they began to take shape. Sophie stumbled back, clutching Alex's arm as a form emerged within the fire, a massive, writhing mass of tendrils, eyes, and shifting shadows. It was incomprehensible, its shape changing constantly, defying logic and reason. Looking at it felt like staring into the abyss. The crowd dropped to their knees, bowing low. "All hail the Keeper of Eternity," they cried in unison. Sophie's legs buckled, but Alex held her up. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, it's very real," the old man said, his eyes alight with fervor. "And you, dear travelers, are its offering this year. Through your sacrifice we endure." Sophie's mind raced, panic clawing at her throat. She glanced at Alex, who was already scanning the crowd, searching for an opening, a way out. The old man raised his staff again, and the chanting resumed, louder and more frenzied. The flames grew darker, the shadows within stretching toward them. "We have to do something," Sophie whispered. Alex nodded, his jaw set. "Not yet. Wait for the right moment." The chanting grew louder, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to echo in Sophie's chest. The bonfire surged higher, the writhing entity within its flames growing more defined. Tendrils of shadow stretched out, curling unnaturally as if testing the air. The townsfolk remained bowed, their voices unified in unholy reverence. "We need to run," Sophie hissed, her voice trembling. "Wait," Alex said, his eyes scanning the square. "We'll only get one shot at this." The old man raised his staff high, his voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. "Great Keeper, accept these humble offerings and continue to bless us with your power." The crowd erupted in a cheer, their grotesque masks bobbing as they rose to their feet. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as she saw movement at the edge of the square, figures stepping forward, carrying heavy ropes. They were heading straight for her and Alex. "Now!" Alex yelled, grabbing Sophie's hand and bolting toward the nearest alley. The sudden movement startled the crowd, but their shock quickly turned to action. Shouts of anger and alarm rang out as the townsfolk gave chase, their masks bouncing eerily as they ran. Sophie's legs burned as she sprinted after Alex, her lungs straining for air. The cobblestones blurred beneath her feet, the shadows of buildings looming on either side. "This way!" Alex shouted, veering into another alley. They burst into a narrow courtyard, the same one they had found earlier with the locked gate. Sophie's heart sank as she saw the chain still firmly in place, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Damn it!" Alex cursed, tugging at the chain with all his strength. Behind them, the townsfolk's footsteps grew louder, their voices chanting once again. The sound seemed to press against Sophie's mind, making it hard to think. "They're coming," she cried, looking around desperately for another exit. Her eyes fell on a stack of crates near the gate. Without thinking, she grabbed Alex's arm and pointed. "Boost me up." He nodded, clasping his hands together to give her a foothold. Sophie scrambled onto the crates, her fingers grasping the top of the iron gate. The metal was cold and rough, but she pulled herself up, swinging her leg over as quickly as she could. "Hurry," she said, reaching down to help Alex. He climbed up after her, his movements hurried but steady. Just as he swung his legs over the gate, the first of the townsfolk appeared in the courtyard. "There they are!" one of them shouted, their voice guttural and distorted. The townsfolk surged forward, their grotesque masks glowing faintly in the firelight. Alex dropped down beside Sophie, grabbing her hand, and they sprinted into the forest without looking back. The trees closed in around them, the branches clawing at their clothes and skin. The chanting faded, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Keep going," Alex urged, his voice hoarse. Sophie's legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, every direction identical to the last. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized they had no idea where they were going. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing onto the ground in exhaustion. Sophie's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the dark trees surrounding them. For now. But deep in the forest, a low rumbling sound began to rise, a noise that didn't belong to any human or animal Sophie had ever heard. The low rumbling sound grew louder, reverberating through the forest like a pulse. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around Sophie and Alex in an invisible grip. Alex grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to keep moving." "But where?" Sophie gasped, her voice trembling. "We're lost." "We'll find a way out," Alex said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "We have to." As they stumbled forward, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky. Sophie glanced back, half expecting to see the townsfolk chasing them, but the forest behind them was empty. Then she heard it, a faint whispering rustle that made her skin crawl. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stopped, his eyes scanning the shadows. "What is it?" Before she could answer, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The rumbling sound intensified, and the air grew thick with an unnatural heat. Sophie clutched Alex's arm as the forest seemed to shift around them, the trees twisting and bending as if alive. A sudden burst of light erupted in the distance, a searing, unnatural glow that cast long, distorted shadows through the trees. Sophie squinted, trying to make sense of the sight, but what she saw made her knees buckle. The light wasn't natural. It emanated from the bonfire, impossibly far from the square they had just fled. The flames had grown higher, and within them, the shape of the entity had fully emerged. It was enormous, a writhing mass of shadow and flame. Tendrils extended outward, pulsating and shifting as though searching for something. Its form defied comprehension, a twisting amalgamation of eyes, mouths, and limbs that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "What is that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "The Keeper," Alex said grimly. Sophie turned to him, her eyes wide. "How do you—" "I don't know," he interrupted, shaking his head. "It's like— I can feel it in my head. It's calling us." Before Sophie could respond, the light from the bonfire surged again, and a deafening roar filled the air. The trees around them began to crack and splinter, their trunks bending toward the light as if drawn by an invisible force. "We need to run," Sophie shouted, pulling Alex's arm. But as they turned, a tendril of shadow shot toward them, moving with impossible speed. It slammed into the ground mere feet from where they stood, sending them sprawling. Sophie scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The tendril twitched, then rose into the air, its tip splitting into a cluster of smaller appendages that writhed like snakes. Alex grabbed a fallen branch, holding it in front of him like a weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. The tendril lashed out, striking the branch and sending Alex stumbling back. Sophie screamed as another tendril shot toward her, but Alex lunged, shoving her out of the way just in time. The tendril slammed into the ground where Sophie had been, leaving a smoking crater. "We can't fight this thing," Sophie cried. "Then we find a way to stop it," Alex shouted, his voice strained. Sophie's eyes darted around the clearing, desperate for any sign of salvation. Her gaze landed on the faint glow of the symbols still etched into the trees nearby. "The symbols!" she said, grabbing Alex's arm. "They're part of the ritual. Maybe if we destroy them—" Another tendril lashed out, cutting her off and narrowly missing her as she dove to the side. Alex nodded, his face set with determination. "It's worth a shot." The couple sprinted toward the nearest tree, the keeper's tendrils thrashing wildly behind them. Sophie grabbed a rock from the ground, using it to scrape at the glowing markings as Alex swung the branch against another. The moment the symbols began to fade, the tendrils recoiled, their movements frantic and disjointed. A deafening roar filled the air, and the light from the bonfire dimmed, flickering violently. "It's working!" Sophie shouted, adrenaline surging through her veins. But the keeper wasn't done yet. As the couple destroyed the symbols, the entity's form grew more solid, its tendrils converging on the clearing in one final, furious assault. The keeper's tendrils tore through the forest with relentless fury, uprooting trees and sending debris flying in every direction. Sophie and Alex ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the chaos as they worked to destroy more of the glowing symbols. "Over here," Alex yelled, pointing to another tree marked with the ominous carvings. He swung the branch with all his strength, splintering the bark and disrupting the glowing runes. The effect was immediate. The tendrils nearest to them recoiled violently, writhing as if in pain. The entity roared, its sound an unearthly mix of rage and anguish that reverberated through Sophie's entire body. "It's weakening," Sophie cried, scrambling to another tree. She grabbed a large rock and smashed it against the carvings, her muscles burning with the effort. The bonfire in the distance sputtered and dimmed, its flames shrinking with each symbol destroyed. The keeper's form began to flicker, its massive tendrils losing their cohesion and dissolving into shadowy mist. But the entity wasn't retreating quietly. A tendril as thick as a tree trunk lashed out, striking the ground inches from Sophie. She stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. "Sophie!" Alex shouted, racing toward her. He dropped the branch and pulled her to her feet, just as another tendril slammed down where she had been. "I'm fine," she gasped, clutching his arm. "We need to keep going." The forest was alive with chaos. Trees groaned and cracked as the keeper thrashed, its remaining tendrils lashing out wildly. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with a suffocating heat. As they ran to the next set of marked trees, Sophie spotted something glinting in the underbrush. She skidded to a stop and crouched, pulling out an oil-soaked torch left behind by the townsfolk. "Alex," she called, holding up the torch, "we can use this." He nodded, grabbing the torch and lighting it against a small ember still burning on the ground. The flames roared to life, casting flickering light across the clearing. "Let's finish this," Alex said, his voice steely. They worked together, using the torch to burn away the symbols on the remaining trees. Each time the markings were destroyed, the keeper's form grew fainter, its tendrils retreating further into the shadows. But as they approached the final tree, the ground split open with a deafening crack, and a massive tendril shot upward, blocking their path. It was larger than the others, its surface glistening with an oily sheen that reflected the dim light of the torch. "Go!" Alex yelled, shoving Sophie toward the tree. "What about you?" she cried, panic rising in her chest. "I'll distract it. Just go." Sophie hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, but the determination in Alex's eyes spurred her into action. She sprinted toward the tree, the glowing symbols almost blinding in their intensity. Behind her, Alex swung the torch wildly, keeping the massive tendril at bay. It whipped toward him, narrowly missing as he ducked and rolled, flames flickering dangerously close to his face. Reaching the tree, Sophie raised the torch high and slammed it against the bark. The fire caught instantly, consuming the carvings in a wave of heat and light. The effect was catastrophic. The keeper let out a final, ear-splitting roar as its form collapsed in on itself, the tendrils disintegrating into black mist. The bonfire in the square erupted in a blinding flash before extinguishing entirely, plunging the forest into darkness. Sophie stumbled back, coughing as the smoke cleared. "Alex," she called, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he said, emerging from the shadows, bruised and battered but alive. He collapsed beside her, both of them panting and shaking as the silence of the forest settled around them. "It's over," Sophie whispered, though the words felt hollow. Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the charred remains of the tree. "Let's get out of here before it comes back." The truck rumbled down the desolate road, its headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she clutched Alex's arm. He leaned back in the seat beside her, his head resting against the window, his breathing still ragged from their escape. The driver, a grizzled man in his 60s, glanced at them periodically. "You kids look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You sure you don't need a hospital?" "No," Sophie said quickly, her voice shaky. "We just need to get as far away as possible." The man nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, you're in luck. Closest town's about 20 miles. I'll drop you off there." Sophie nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The forest loomed on either side, its shadows stretching unnaturally in the headlights. Minutes passed in tense silence. The farther they got from the town, the lighter Sophie felt, as if an invisible weight were lifting from her chest. But the memory of the keeper, the bonfire, and the masked townsfolk lingered, etched into her mind like a scar. "Do you believe in things like curses?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver raised an eyebrow. "Curses? Can't say I do. But out here folks believe all kinds of things. Some of it's just stories, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, sometimes stories come from somewhere real." Sophie exchanged a glance with Alex. The truck hit a small bump, jolting her back to the present. When they reached the next town, the driver pulled into a small diner parking lot. "This is as far as I'm going," he said. "Thank you," Alex said, his voice hoarse as he climbed out. Sophie followed, and they stood together, watching the truck disappear down the road. The neon sign of the diner buzzed faintly, its light casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. Inside, the diner was quiet, the hum of an old jukebox filling the space. A waitress approached, her expression kind but curious. "Rough night?" "You could say that," Sophie said, managing a weak smile. They ordered coffee, sitting in silence as the events of the night replayed in Sophie's mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the keeper's writhing form and the unblinking eyes of the masked townsfolk. "I still don't understand how that place exists," Sophie said quietly. "It's like it was trapped in time." Alex nodded, staring into his coffee. "And we were supposed to be part of it. If we hadn't—" He trailed off, his hand tightening around the cup. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Sophie stopped by the counter to pay. Her eyes wandered to a bulletin board cluttered with old photographs, yellowing newspapers, and local announcements. One photo caught her attention, a grainy black-and-white image of a bonfire, surrounded by people in masks. The caption beneath it read, "Hallowmere Festival, 1924. Her blood ran cold. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. He joined her, his face paling as he read the caption. The waitress noticed their reaction and frowned. "Something wrong? Where did this picture come from?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. The waitress shrugged. "Oh, it's been there forever. Some old festival from a town that burned down a long time ago. They say it happens every year, though no one knows where. Just stories, you know." Sophie turned to Alex, her chest tight. "We need to leave, now." They walked out into the cool night, the distant hum of the forest still in their ears. As they climbed into a cab and drove away, Sophie glanced out the window. For a moment she thought she saw something in the reflection, a faint glowing symbol etched onto the corner of the glass. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.